So far, we have been discussing different theories on the development of personality as part of the growth and maturation process. While Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson differed on many issues, they agreed on one central issue. By the time we all reach adolescence and adulthood, each of us has developed a set of personality traits that define, both to the broader world and to ourselves, just who we are. Given that we all have personality traits, how should we describe those traits so as to be able to distinguish between individuals? Looking at these images, taken from the chart describing two of Erik Erikson's stages of development, we might be able to infer some personality traits of the individuals pictured here. The adolescent boy on the left seems to be somewhat inward. His face, especially his mouth, shows little in the way of expression. He seems somewhat introverted. By contrast, the young woman pictured on the right seems to be a very agreeable type person who seems to enjoy interacting with others. She seems, at least from my perspective, somewhat more extroverted than the adolescent boy on the left. On the other hand, if asked how conscientious these two individuals are and how well they are able to focus on the tasks at hand, we can't really say. Here are pictures of some Stanford students taken from the Stanford website. Looking at them, what traits or characteristics do they seem to convey? Here are some words I might apply to them. I would certainly say that the students at the top appear eager as well as energetic. From looking at how they seem to be enjoying working as a group, I might also consider them to be fun-loving. The students in the bottom picture also come across as energetic. I might also describe them as intelligent as well as sensible. Given that all these students seem to be helping out at a Stanford event, I would describe each of them as willing. How about these students? They certainly come across to me as cheerful as well as confident. Given that they are working as a welcome team, presumably greeting other students who are new to campus, I would describe them as hardworking and helpful. If I were a new student on campus and I saw them, I might describe them as likable and presumably reliable, so I could likely feel comfortable asking them for directions or advice. So far, we've used 12 words to describe some of the personality traits of these students. If we kept on going, listing all the words that describe not only these students, but that could be used to describe an entire range of individuals in both positive and negative contexts, how many words might be on our list? In the 1930s, psychologists Gordon Allport and Henry Odbert attempted to answer this question. They published their findings in 1936. Their approach was to look at every word in the 1925 edition of Webster's New International Dictionary and indicate whether the word might be used to describe a personality trait or behavior. Of the 400,000 words in the dictionary, they identified nearly 18,000 that described personality, comprising 4.5% of the English language. While this was certainly interesting, it was of very little practical use. In order to develop cogent theories of personality traits, we needed to markedly reduce the number of words used to describe traits. Beginning in the 1940s, Raymond Cattell began what would be a several-decade project to simplify the list of words used as personality descriptors. Rather than using individual words, he suggested that we instead look for words that cluster together, either by describing similar characteristics or describing the opposite of these characteristics. In work published in 1946, he gave a number of examples of these clusters. One he labeled as integrity and altruism versus dishonesty and undependability. He labeled another as realism and reliability versus neuroticism and changeability. While his initial work in the 1940s identified 50 personality clusters, by the 1970s he had narrowed these down to 16. This number of personality clusters was still somewhat cumbersome for practical use. Somehow, the number of trait clusters needed to be narrowed and also needed to be validated scientifically. Part of the problem these early personality theorists faced was the difficulty in manually finding word clusters and associations. Then, in the 1970s and 80s, their task was made much easier by the development and widespread use of computers. Using a statistical methodology referred to as factor analysis, Goldberg was able to reanalyze data from multiple earlier studies to identify words that described personality traits and that tended to refer either to similar or opposite characteristics. For example, based on his computer analysis, the term conscientiousness seemed to be referring to the same characteristic as the term dependability. Similarly, the term emotional stability seemed to be referring to an analogous yet opposite trait as the word neuroticism. Accordingly, these words were each included in the same overall trait. Based on these analyses, Goldberg identified 5 core personality traits, which he referred to as the Big Five. The 5 categories he identified are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, a factor he referred to either as emotional stability or neuroticism, and the 5th factor of openness. For each of these 5 factors, an individual respondent can be anywhere on a continuum from fully exhibiting the trait to exhibiting the opposite of that trait. In order to measure where an individual is on this continuum for each of the traits, Oliver John and colleagues developed a survey instrument which they referred to as the Big Five inventory. On the inventory, they asked the respondent to consider the statement, "I see myself as someone who," and then to respond to each of 46 different descriptors indicating on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree how well the descriptor reflects the respondent's own traits. By means of example, the respondent would be asked if he or she is talkative, does a thorough job, is depressed or blue, tends to be disorganized, perseveres until the task is finished. From a statistical analysis of the responses to the 46 descriptors, it is then possible to rate the respondent on each of the Big Five factors. In the 1999 edition of the Handbook of Personality, Oliver John and Sanjay Srivastava were able to conclude that, quote, after decades of research, the field is finally approaching consensus on a general taxonomy of personality traits, the Big Five personality dimensions, unquote. They went on, however, to qualify somewhat how the Big Five are best understood, suggesting that, quote, the Big Five structure does not imply that personality differences can be reduced to only 5 traits. Rather, these 5 dimensions represent personality at the broadest level of abstraction, and each dimension summarizes a large number of distinct, more specific personality characteristics. Another important point to emphasize is that the psychologists who developed the Big Five inventory considered it as a reflection of personality, but not of cognitive ability. McRae and John, in their 1992 article describing the Big Five and how they might be used, stated explicitly that, quote, when factored jointly with personality variables, measures of cognitive ability typically form a distinct 6th factor. Once the use of the Big Five trait assessment received widespread support, an important question came up. Do children exhibit the Big Five traits to the same extent as adults? Sarah Hampson, Lewis Goldberg, and their colleagues were able to reanalyze a data set gathered between 1959 and 1967 in a study of more than 2,500 elementary school children in Hawaii. The original study had been an important part of the research effort that resulted in identification of the Big Five traits. In the original study, teachers had been asked to evaluate children in their class based on a series of attributes. Hampson et al. Were able to reevaluate the original data using only those attributes that later became part of the Big Five assessment. They were then able to contact 963 of the individuals in the original study, who then were between 40 and 50 years of age. They gathered data from these adult subjects on a range of health behaviors and health status indicators. They found a significant association between certain of the Big Five traits exhibited as a child and health behaviors as an adult. For example, children who were rated by their teachers as higher on conscientiousness were less likely to be smokers as adults and more likely to rate their overall health status as better. Similarly, children rated higher on agreeableness were less likely as adults to smoke and less likely to be obese. These findings suggest that personality traits exhibited as children, as perceived by elementary school teachers, are associated with behaviors as adults that affect health status. A similar study by Friedman et al. Analyzed data compiled in the 1920s by Louis Terman, an educational psychologist at Stanford University. Terman began following more than 1,500 children in California schools, all of whom were rated as intellectually gifted, using what is now called the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale. While Terman's work came several decades before the development of the Big Five scales, one of the specific childhood traits he included in his study of these children was conscientiousness, as rated by the children's teachers and parents. Researchers have been gathering follow-up data on the original subjects on a regular basis since the study was initiated. Using these data, Friedman found a strong association between conscientiousness as a child and subsequent length of life, with lower rates of smoking explaining part but not all of this difference. These studies confirm the association between the personality traits exhibited by children as rated by their parents and teachers using the Big Five scale, and subsequent behavior and well-being of these children when they become adults. As we might expect, however, not all psychologists or health professionals see the Big Five traits in the same light as the authors who discussed them above. Others have worked to develop additional measures of psychological traits distinct from the Big Five scale that they perceive to be of equal validity. We will address some of these in the lecture that follows.